Howdy, Aggies. I'm Porter Garner, Class 79, President and CEO of the Association of Former Students. Welcome to the Association of Former Students 2022 Worldwide Roll Call for the Absent. This morning, we are coming to you live from the Clayton W. Williams Jr. Alumni Center here on the campus of Texas A&M University, where over 50 volunteers are joining us this morning to participate in our roll call for the absent. I have long believed that of all our grand traditions, muster is indeed our most sacred. I further believe that of all of our traditions, it represents the most solemn, most trusted, and most sacred tradition of Texas A&M. It is a pleasure to be with you today. We thank you for doing your part to honor our noble legacy and continue the grand tradition of muster. Thank you for marking fellow Aggies present in your hearts today.
Roll call for the absent by Dr. John Ashton, class of 1906. In many lands and climes, this April day, proud sons of Texas A&M unite. Our loyalty to school and country we pay, and seal our pact with bond of common might. We live again those happy days of yore, on campus, field, and classroom, hall, at drill. Fond memories bring a sigh, but nothing more. Now we are men, and life is one great thrill. On Fortress Isle 80 years ago, a group of gallant Aggies, led by Moore, held simple rights, which to us all doth say, the spirit shall prevail over cannon roar. They thought of home and all we hold most dear. Where are they now, those boys we knew so well? Ask of the winds, let smiles repress a tear. Think only of their glory when they fell. Corregidor, forever more a hallowed name to countless sons of Texans yet unborn. Symbolic like, it stands for deathless fame, a shrine sublime till resurrection morn. Softly call the muster. Let comrade answer, here. Their spirits hover round us as if to bring us cheer. Mark them present in our hearts. We'll meet some other day. There is no death, but life eternal for heroes such as they.
The 2022 Worldwide Roll Call for the Absent comprises 1,394 names of Aggies whose deaths were reported to the Association of Former Students since the previous muster. Some of these deaths happened more than a year ago, but the passing was not previously reported, so the name has not been called previously at any Aggie muster. The Worldwide Roll Call for the Absent will proceed from oldest class year to youngest. However, names added to this roll after April 12th are grouped together near the end, followed by the names of some honored faculty, staff, and friends of Texas A&M. Names that are initially called incorrectly will be called again at a correction segment at the end. For help finding a specific name in this roll call, please visit tx.ag/2022index.
Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pendleton Avent, class of 1909.
Here.
Claude Elmo Barron, class of 1913.
Here.
William Goldapple, class of 1921.
Here.
Russell Montrose Badcock, class of 1928.
Here.
Leroy Mack Kidd, class of 1939.
Here.
Byram Theodore Wayner, class of 1939.
Here.
Johnny Calvin Harrod, class of 1940.
Here.
Carl Alvin Newman, class of 1940.
Here.
Robert M. Campion, Jr., class of 1941.
Here.
Isaac Newton Hickman, class of 1941.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel William Nick Hollis, class of 1941.
Here.
Owen Ellsworth Jones, class of 1941.
Here.
Seth Paul Martin, Jr., class of 1941.
Here.
Lawrence E. Sample, class of 1941.
Here.
Francis Marion Edwards, class of 1942.
Here.
Perry A. Luth, Jr., class of 1942.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Victor Burks, Jr., class of 1943.
Here.
George Elliott Christ, class of 1943.
Here.
Errol Ollie Johnson, class of 1943.
Here.
T.K. Condren, class of 1944.
Here.
Dr. Phil Davis, class of 1944.
Here.
John Hauser Evans, class of 1944.
Here.
Henry William Hilton, class of 1944.
Here.
Dr. Harrison Sykes Martin, class of 1944.
Here.
Robert Lee Schultz, class of 1944.
Here.
Philip Albert Torty, Jr., class of 1944.
Here.
Leo Wolf, class of 1944.
Here.
Roland E. Ball, class of 1945.
Here.
Albert Barney Harrod, Jr., class of 1945.
Here.
Edwin Williams Schmidt, class of 1945.
Here.
Uvalde Stormer, class of 1945.
Here.
Eugene Sublett Broussard, class of 1946.
Here.
Burkle J. Carmichael, class of 1946.
Here.
Roy Reeves Dye, class of 1946.
Here.
Roy G. Freeman, Jr., class of 1946.
Here.
Edwin M. Catton, Jr., class of 1946.
Here.
Harry Maynard Kreidler, class of 1946.
Here.
Floyd Edwin Lupo, class of 1946.
Here.
William Henry Mayer, class of 1946.
Here.
Philip Abbott Mascalette, class of 1946.
Here.
Dr. James Forrest Mathis, class of 1946.
Here.
Roy S. Reynolds, Jr., class of 1946.
Here.
Albert Charles Seidemann, Jr., class of 1946.
Here.
David M. Seligman, class of 1946.
Here.
Dr. Roy House Zufelt, class of 1946.
Here.
Wilburn Frank Albers, class of 1947.
Here.
Marvin H. Bender, class of 1947.
Here.
Dr. Robert Dean Chenoweth, class of 1947.
Here.
Frank Allen Eastman, class of 1947.
Here.
Frederick Alexander Fleming, Jr., class of 1947.
Here.
William Joel Garrett, class of 1947.
Here.
Arthur B. Gerwitz, class of 1947.
Here.
Dr. James F. Kelty, class of 1947.
Here.
Fred Mangett, class of 1947.
Here.
James Masterson Parker, class of 1947.
Here.
Colonel Joe Thomas Rogers, class of 1947.
Here.
J. W. Stewart, class of 1947.
Here.
Lloyd Raymond Riley, class of 1947.
Here.
Lawrence David Brady, class of 1948.
Here.
Blish Breland Jr., class of 1948.
Here.
Richard Joan Brogdon, class of 1948.
Here.
Calvin Clyde Crittenden, class of 1948.
Here.
Henry Randall Ground, class of 1948.
Here.
Stephen Couch Helbing Sr., class of 1948.
Here.
Willis Barron Hicks, class of 1948.
Here.
Edwin Marable Laughlin, class of 1948.
Here.
Ralph Vernon Lunsford Sr., class of 1948.
Here.
William Barclay Palm Jr., class of 1948.
Here.
Henry Whit Phillips Jr., class of 1948.
Here.
Dr. Monty Yale Swatzel, class of 1948.
Here.
John Elbert Watson, class of 1948.
Here.
Dr. Robert Kenneth Williams, class of 1948.
Here.
Nolan Harold Brunson, class of 1949.
Here.
Max Edwin Burkhart Jr., class of 1949.
Here.
Henry Malone Clayton Jr., class of 1949.
Here.
Creed Lamar Ford Jr., class of 1949.
Here.
First Lieutenant Jasper Truett Hassey, class of 1949.
Here.
Homer B. Johnson, class of 1949.
Here.
Earl Stan Keese, class of 1949.
Here.
Aubrey Lee Kaufman, class of 1949.
Here.
William Lucian Cruz, class of 1949.
Here.
John Joseph Luther, class of 1949.
Here.
James Tillman Martin, class of 1949.
Here.
Melvin Kenneth Mobley, class of 1949.
Here.
Alfred Thomas Pospischal, class of 1949.
Here.
Corder Samuel Reynolds Jr., class of 1949.
Here.
Dr. Herbert Rogers, class of 1949.
Here.
Robert M. Scoggins, class of 1949.
Here.
William Thomas Stevens, class of 1949.
Here.
William Lewis Straight, class of 1949.
Here.
Wayne Hamaker Terrell, class of 1949.
Here.
John Manley Vaughn, class of 1949.
Here.
Roland Eugene Bassell, class of 1950.
Here.
James Earl Byers, class of 1950.
Here.
Harold Carl Byler Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
John Seals Cameron Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Cecil Harvey Carr, class of 1950.
Here.
Lloyd Earl Carroll Sr., class of 1950.
Here.
Gilbert V. Chambers, class of 1950.
Here.
The Honorable James Edward Chappell, class of 1950.
Here.
Emil Joe Kromchak, class of 1950.
Here.
Edgar Eugene Ewing, class of 1950.
Here.
Clarence Rye Gordon, class of 1950.
Here.
Charles Carroll Gover, class of 1950.
Here.
Robert Clark Greaves Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Timothy Tynan Griesenbeck Sr., class of 1950.
Here.
Dr. Neil Ross Gerwitz, class of 1950.
Here. Here.
Walter Leroy Hahn, class of 1950.
Here.
John Henry Happ Sr., class of 1950.
Here.
Dr. Curtis Chester Harlan Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Roy Ray Harris, class of 1950.
Here.
Jerry Bland Herdenberger, class of 1950.
Here.
Eugene J. Hogan, class of 1950.
Here.
William L. Lyles, class of 1950.
Here.
Dr. James Milton Mathis, class of 1950.
Here.
Elton Lyle McAndrew, class of 1950.
Here.
Conrad Carl Ohlendorf, class of 1950.
Here.
Floyd Allen Pace, class of 1950.
Here.
Sam Glass Pate, class of 1950.
Here.
Robert E. Patrick, class of 1950.
Here.
William Lewis Schuman, class of 1950.
Here.
Charles Lewis Stanford, class of 1950. Leonard Rudolph Stanislav, class of 1950.
Here.
Ted Francis Sullins, class of 1950.
Here. Here.
Max Herschel Tanner, Jr., class of 1950.
Here. Here.
Amos Glenn Welder, Jr., class of 1950.
Here. Here.
Blake B. Williams, Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Wilbur Joe Worley, class of 1950.
Here.
Richard Oscar Warnett, class of 1950.
Here.
William Matthew Bell, class of 1951.
Here.
Ishmael Granville Calloway, class of 1951.
Here.
Forrest Allen Garb, class of 1951.
Here.
James Edwin Galt, class of 1951.
Here.
William Henley Goldston, class of 1951.
Here.
Herman C. Golub, class of 1951.
Here.
Brigadier General Keith L. Hargrove, class of 1951.
Here.
Robert Conrad Howren, class of 1951.
Here.
John P. Hewson, class of 1951.
Here.
Joe Thomas Lenneman, class of 1951.
Here.
Levon Massengale, Jr., class of 1951.
Here.
James Cooper Mitchum, class of 1951.
Here.
Major General Wayman C. Nutt, class of 1951.
Here.
George Warren Orr, Jr., class of 1951.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Lloyd Marlin Pape, class of 1951.
Here.
Marion Scoggins Porter, class of 1951.
Here.
Roy Earl Reed Sr., class of 1951.
Here.
Johnny Leon Rumfield, class of 1951.
Here.
Douglas Lee Simmons, class of 1951.
Here.
John Charles Standard, class of 1951.
Here.
Billy Glenn Walton, class of 1951.
Here.
John W. White, class of 1951.
Here.
Gary Anderson, class of 1952.
Here.
Donald Blair Austin, class of 1952.
Here.
John W. Balzer, class of 1952.
Here.
Arnold Bartow Barfield, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
William Dempsey Bennett, class of 1952.
Here.
Kenneth Dorman Bishop, class of 1952.
Here.
R.G. James Brockles, class of 1952.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Robert Henry Bynes, class of 1952.
Here.
Robert William Cooper, class of 1952.
Here.
Jimmy Royce Darling, class of 1952.
Here.
Joseph V. Davidson, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
Virgil Prock Dean, class of 1952.
Here.
Roy Harp Donaldson, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
Leo F. Ernstes, class of 1952.
Here.
Lester G. Fissler, class of 1952.
Here.
Bob Buell Fox, class of 1952.
Here. Here.
Charles James Gabriel, class of 1952.
Here.
John Leslie Hall, class of 1952.
Here. Here.
Dr. Teddy James Hirsch, Sr., class of 1952.
Here. Here.
Lieutenant Colonel James Morrow Ivy, the 4th, class of 1952.
Here. Here.
Ernest Clayton Johnson, Jr., class of 1952.
Here. Here.
Robert Basil Johnson, class of 1952.
Here.
Dr. John Edward Thomas Leonard, class of 1952.
Here. Here.
William Peake Mallory III, class of 1952.
Here. Here.
Dale Dean Martin, class of 1952.
Here. Here.
William Black Mabane, class of 1952.
Here. Here.
Gussie Edwin Meisenheimer, Jr., class of 1952.
Here. Here.
John Jack Millender, class of 1952.
Here.
John Kimball Miller, class of 1952.
Here.
Frank Ray Morris, class of 1952.
Here.
Paul J. Sanders, class of 1952.
Here.
Dr. Charles Earl Scootland, class of 1952.
Here.
Jack Harvey Shell, class of 1952.
Here. Here.
David James Simons, class of 1952.
Here. Here.
Lynn Walter Stallings, Jr., class of 1952.
Here. Here.
Dr. Robert Trobway Terrell, class of 1952.
Here. Here.
John Edwards Van Noos, class of 1952.
Here. Here.
Max Wade White, class of 1952.
Here. Here.
David Maurice Yeager, class of 1952.
Here. Here.
William McKissack Young, class of 1952.
Here.
Dr. Patrick Anthony Alessandra, class of 1953.
Here.
Howard C. Allison, class of 1953.
Here.
Dr. James Edward Allison, Sr., class of 1953.
Here.
Robert Eugene Arhelger, class of 1953.
Here.
Edward Teese Austin, class of 1953.
Here.
Benny Kuno Balke, class of 1953.
Here.
Gerald Ray Bell, class of 1953.
Here.
Jeff Clinton Bowie, class of 1953.
Here.
Fred E. Burns, class of 1953.
Here.
George W. Carlisle, Jr., class of 1953.
Here.
Jimmy Wallace Cogburn, class of 1953.
Here.
Colonel James R. Compton, class of 1953.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel John B. Cooley, class of 1953.
Here.
Dr. Charles Richard Cousins, Sr., class of 1953.
Here.
Dr. Julian Fred Cross, class of 1953.
Here.
Colonel Martin John Dvorak, class of 1953.
Here.
John Henry Felton, class of 1953.
Here.
Foster Lee Gray, class of 1953.
Here.
Willard Russell Green, class of 1953.
Here.
Don R. Heath, class of 1953.
Here.
Theron Dale Higginbotham, class of 1953.
Here.
Jimmy Russell Holder, class of 1953.
Here.
Robert Eugene Insall, Sr., class of 1953.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Harlan C. Johnston, class of 1953.
Here.
Clifford Harris LeBlanc, Jr., class of 1953.
Here.
Alan Lewis Leon, class of 1953.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Marcus G. Loader, class of 1953.
Here.
Ray Lauren Lyon, class of 1953.
Here.
Ben Allen Madden, Jr., class of 1953.
Here.
Conrad Walker McGurrick, class of 1953.
Here.
Morrison Hawkins Mebane, class of 1953.
Here.
John Lewis Merrill, Sr., class of 1953.
Here.
Dahlman Emmanuel Randall, class of 1953.
Here.
Charles Aaron Richards, class of 1953.
Here.
Robert Emery Rigney, class of 1953.
Here.
Harry Van Steele, Jr., class of 1953.
Here.
Jim H. Upmore, Sr., class of 1953.
Here.
Roland Ray Willis, class of 1953.
Here.
Nicholas Joseph Alexander Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Donald Kobe Altwine, class of 1954.
Here.
Robert Clinton Anderson, class of 1954.
Here.
William Richard Caspier, class of 1954.
Here.
Dr. Neville P. Clark, class of 1954.
Here.
Dr. John K. Cooper, class of 1954.
Here.
Flaky R. DeLay Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Robert Joseph Drozd, class of 1954.
Here.
Charles Garrett Guard, class of 1954.
Here.
John Elliott Ginn, class of 1954.
Here.
Charles Barton Griffin, Sr., class of 1954.
Here.
Luther Edward Harville Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Elmer Joe Hickman, class of 1954.
Here.
Otha L. Jones, class of 1954.
Here.
Sheldon Millum Kindle, class of 1954.
Here.
Dr. Harry James Leaders, class of 1954.
Here.
Rudolph Curry McDuff, class of 1954.
Here.
Frank Gary O'Connell, class of 1954.
Here.
Dr. Richard Stranahan Ruiz, class of 1954.
Here.
John Stockwell Samuels III, class of 1954.
Here.
John Edward Scott, class of 1954.
Here.
Dr. John Brake Scrogan, class of 1954.
Here.
Gus David Shaw, class of 1954.
Here.
Dr. Eugene T. Skidmore, class of 1954.
Here.
Gene Austin Smith, class of 1954.
Here.
Carl Bruce Sturzing, Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Leland Moore Stevens, class of 1954.
Here.
Edward T. Taniguchi, class of 1954.
Here.
Carl Kenneth Wall, class of 1954.
Here.
Robert Batting Willman, class of 1954.
Here.
Clifford Wayne Witherspoon, class of 1954.
Here.
Dr. William A. Young, Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Gilbert James Altum, class of 1955.
Here.
Charles Albert Anderson, class of 1955.
Here.
Carlos Umberto Arguindegui, class of 1955.
Here.
Jerry E. Brazel, class of 1955.
Here.
Colonel Earl Melvin Byes, class of 1955.
Here.
Luis Roberto Celerier, class of 1955.
Here.
John Irvin Christian, class of 1955.
Here.
Colonel John M. Collison, class of 1955.
Here.
Thomas E. Cox, class of 1955.
Here.
William Morgan Drum, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Roy Conrad Eckerd, class of 1955.
Here.
Eugene Chester Fulton, class of 1955.
Here.
Louis Thomas Fickey, class of 1955.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Athol Carl Flanagan, class of 1955.
Here.
William Boyd Fry, Jr., class of 1955.
Here.
Richard O. Gregg, class of 1955.
Here.
Alvin L. Groves, class of 1955.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Ballard Andrew Guest, Jr., class of 1955.
Here.
Billy C. Guffey, class of 1955.
Here.
John Lewis Harlan, class of 1955.
Here.
William Richard Heaton, Sr., class of 1955.
Here.
Robert W. Herman, class of 1955.
Here.
William Edwin Howard, class of 1955.
Here.
Doran Victor Jones, class of 1955.
Here.
James Lyle Milstead, class of 1955.
Here.
Donald Edwin Noble, class of 1955.
Here.
John Henry Pelt, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. William R. Pence, class of 1955.
Here.
Earl Lee Pike, Jr., class of 1955.
Here.
William Clay Roaming, class of 1955.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Dale Sissel, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Wynne Macaulay Snoots, class of 1955.
Here.
Anthony E. Spacia, class of 1955.
Here.
Sidney Joseph Terrio, Jr., class of 1955.
Here.
Thomas Paul Tuduz, class of 1955.
Here.
Alan Edwin Turner, class of 1955.
Here.
Colonel David Edward Lee Verbal, class of 1955.
Here.
Sehan Lester Warnicki II, class of 1955.
Here.
Curtis Ray Wilhelm, class of 1955.
Here.
Gerald L. Wizig, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Josiah Wistar Worthington, Jr., class of 1955.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Meade Rex Bramlett, Sr., class of 1956.
Here.
Alan Moore Brandt, class of 1956.
Here.
James B. Brewster, class of 1956.
Here.
Merrill Franklin Cobb, class of 1956.
Here.
Dr. William Marvin Koch, Jr., class of 1956.
Here.
Charles J. Hicks, class of 1956.
Here.
Thomas Lloyd Holt III, class of 1956.
Here.
Stanley Paul Holtz, class of 1956.
Here.
Thomas Ward Moore, class of 1956.
Here.
Colonel Edwin Stanhope Olsmith, class of 1956.
Here.
David Crosby Parnell, class of 1956.
Here.
Paul E. Prosick, class of 1956.
Here.
Newburn Ray, Jr., class of 1956.
Here.
William Ray Reed, class of 1956.
Here.
W. Cecil Stewart, class of 1956.
Here.
William Eugene Stubblefield, class of 1956.
Here.
Don Arnold Tedder, Sr., class of 1956.
Here.
Hugh Lawson Wickham, Jr., class of 1956.
Here.
Glenn Leroy Wistrand, class of 1956.
Here.
Carrie Eugene Wright, class of 1956.
Here.
Jerry M. Betzel, class of 1957.
Here.
Richard Harlan Berlin, class of 1957.
Here.
Glenn Ross Chandler, class of 1957.
Here.
Joseph Leon Curtis, class of 1957.
Here.
Hugh Thomas Davison, class of 1957.
Here.
Benny E. Fichte, class of 1957.
Here.
Dr. Michael Ridge Gaines, class of 1957.
Here.
Andreas Gomez, class of 1957.
Here.
John E. Goomert, class of 1957. Bernard K. Halverson, class of 1957.
Here.
Vincent Drennan Hartley, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
Christian Frederick Hoffman, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
Dr. Donald Edgar Johnson, class of 1957.
Here.
Liston Xander Maynor, class of 1957.
Here.
Robert Walter McCleskey, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
Justin O. McSpadden, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
Lonnie Edward Myrick, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
John Edward Nordine, class of 1957.
Here.
Fletcher Meredith Poole, class of 1957.
Here.
William D. Powell, class of 1957.
Here.
Dr. Vanis Wilbanks Redmond, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
Colonel Luther James Starr, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
Dr. Samuel L. Sullivan, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
Clifton Ewell Warwick, class of 1957.
Here.
Colonel John A. Webb, class of 1957.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Donald E. Williams, class of 1957.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Donald Ray Asselin, class of 1958.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel William Allen Beasley, class of 1958.
Here.
Colonel Bobby John Carter, class of 1958.
Here.
David Melton Cox, class of 1958.
Here.
Sam Ray Cunningham, class of 1958.
Here.
Roy Bennett Davis Jr., class of 1958.
Here.
Franklin DeMuth, class of 1958.
Here.
Richard Henry Drez, class of 1958.
Here.
David Eby, class of 1958.
Here.
William Elbert Felton Jr., class of 1958.
Here.
James Bertrand Fickey, Sr., class of 1958.
Here.
Cecil Glenn Ford, class of 1958.
Here.
Dr. Leonard Matthew Fuson, class of 1958.
Here.
Forrest M. Garlow, class of 1958.
Here.
Reagan Webb George, class of 1958.
Here.
Ewan D. Hale, class of 1958.
Here.
John Russell Hart, class of 1958.
Here.
Dale Himmelreich, class of 1958.
Here.
William Samuel Hipp III, class of 1958.
Here.
John Fleming Houchins III, class of 1958.
Here.
Dr. James Thomas Jones, class of 1958.
Here.
Robert J. Kuhn, class of 1958.
Here.
Gus W. Kunith III, class of 1958.
Here.
Louis Andrew LaBelle, class of 1958.
Here.
Oswell Lamar Martin, class of 1958.
Here.
Dr. Gerald Need McGowan, class of 1958.
Here.
Jack William Montgomery, class of 1958.
Here.
Dr. Clarence Walter Newman, class of 1958.
Here.
Gerald A. Parker, class of 1958.
Here.
Dr. Melvin J. Pate, Jr., class of 1958.
Here.
Marco J. Perrone, class of 1958.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel James Stanton Pierce, class of 1958.
Here.
Fidel Carlos Ramirez, class of 1958.
Here.
Cadwell Lewis Ray, class of 1958.
Here.
Joe C. Revelette, Jr., class of 1958.
Here.
Donald Ray Schilling, class of 1958.
Here.
Robert Bruce Shearer, class of 1958.
Here.
Charles E. Swearingen, Jr., class of 1958.
Here.
Cyrus Carter Barkis, class of 1959.
Here.
James Spencer Bethel, class of 1959.
Here.
Thomas Curtis Billingsley, class of 1959.
Here.
James H. Blackburn, Jr., class of 1959.
Here.
Ewald Joseph Blaschke, class of 1959.
Here.
James Worth Boykin, Sr., class of 1959.
Here.
John William Buck, class of 1959.
Here.
Leo Dudley Cloud, class of 1959.
Here.
Fred Lamar Cole, Jr., class of 1959.
Here.
Robert Alton Collins, class of 1959.
Here.
Alpheus Floyd Cooper, Jr., class of 1959.
Here.
Roy Jean Coram, class of 1959.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Tracy Kemp Dorset, Jr., class of 1959.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Rex Carlos Easley, class of 1959.
Here.
Emil Joseph Eichblatt, Jr., class of 1959.
Here.
John Frederick Euler, class of 1959.
Here.
Kenneth L. Evans, class of 1959.
Here.
Ben Maurice Fitzgerald, class of 1959.
Here.
Alvin Joel French, class of 1959.
Here.
Dr. Roman Raul Garza, class of 1959.
Here.
William Harold Goolsby, Jr., class of 1959.
Here.
John Robert Houston, Jr., class of 1959.
Here.
Charles P. Jackson, class of 1959.
Here.
Michael Joe Larson, class of 1959.
Here.
Magnus Arlen Lindsay, class of 1959.
Here.
Samuel Stephen McKinney III, class of 1959.
Here.
Alexander Mary Ackery, class of 1959.
Here.
David G. Middleton, class of 1959.
Here.
Mason J. Neville, class of 1959.
Here.
Arthur Richard Peacock, class of 1959.
Here.
Roberto D. Perez, class of 1959.
Here.
Louis Joseph Poth Jr., class of 1959.
Here. Here.
James Travis Roberts Jr., class of 1959.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Bloom Sanders, Jr., class of 1959.
Here. Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Robert Eugene Schmid, class of 1959.
Here.
James Lewis Struthwolf, class of 1959.
Here.
Dr. Danny R. Tidwell, class of 1959.
Here.
William Earl Tipton, Sr., class of 1959.
Here.
Ross J. Todaro, Sr., class of 1959.
Here.
Reverend Dr. William Paul Troyd, class of 1959.
Here. Here.
Colonel Gilmer Dean Ulbricht, class of 1959.
Here. Here.
John T. Williams III, class of 1959.
Here. Here.
William Finch Wimberly, class of 1959.
Here.
Captain Joe Don Winkle, class of 1959.
Here. Here.
Robert Eldridge Bain, Sr., class of 1960.
Here. Here.
John Harold Banworth, class of 1960.
Here.
Eugene W. Barkmeyer, class of 1960.
Here. Here.
Charles Clyde Cherry, class of 1960.
Here.
Weldon Kennerly Curry, class of 1960.
Here. Here.
Robert C. Dabney, class of 1960.
Here. Here.
Ralph Winston Ellis, class of 1960.
Here. Here.
Richard Garrison Geisland, Jr., class of 1960.
Here.
Glenn Edwin Guy, class of 1960.
Here. Here.
Dr. Robert Allen Jones, class of 1960.
Here. Here.
Herman August Lehman, class of 1960.
Here. Here.
Charles Frank Milstead, Sr., class of 1960.
Here.
Thomas Andrew Moore, class of 1960.
Here. Here.
Joseph N. Owens, class of 1960.
Here. Here.
Charles Ray Phillips, class of 1960.
Here. Here.
Claybert Wayland Quisenberry, class of 1960.
Here. Here.
Alton Martell Shuttlesworth, class of 1960.
Here. Here.
Robert Gary Van Winkle, class of 1960.
Here.
Johnny Francis Walling, Sr., class of 1960.
Here.
Richard Sidney Watts, class of 1960.
Here.
Samuel Clayton Welsh, class of 1960.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Herman E. Weinecke, class of 1960.
Here.
Joseph H. Willems, class of 1960.
Here.
Dr. Woody Prentice Williams, Jr., class of 1960.
Here.
Harold L. Adams, class of 1961.
Here. Here.
Dr. Joseph Robert Berry, Jr., class of 1961.
Here.
Robert C. Bennett, Jr., class of 1961.
Here.
John Duncan Bounds, class of 1961.
Here.
Charles Alvin Brown, class of 1961.
Here.
William Albert Cropper, class of 1961.
Here.
Charles E. Davidoff, class of 1961.
Here. Here.
Raymond Thomas Ellison II, class of 1961.
Here. Here.
John Orrin Good, class of 1961.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Dan Alfred Gahn, class of 1961.
Here. Here.
Harvey Lee Jirasek, class of 1961.
Here. Here.
Stephen Lee Johnson, class of 1961.
Here. Here.
Dr. Ben Earl Johnston, class of 1961.
Here. Here.
Gyron Brantley Laycock, class of 1961.
Here. Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Edgar Lilly, class of 1961.
Here. Here.
Curtis Raymond Lyons, class of 1961.
Here. Here.
Lawrence A. Milner, class of 1961.
Here. Here.
Charles Clinton Murphy, class of 1961.
Here.
John Kenneth Neal, class of 1961.
Here.
Jean William Newman, class of 1961.
Here.
Roy F. Northrop, class of 1961.
Here.
Dr. Albert George Alray III, class of 1961.
Here.
Pablo Ornelas Jr., class of 1961.
Here.
Donald Joe Osborne, class of 1961.
Here. Here.
Charles Marlowe Preston Jr., class of 1961.
Here. Here.
Jerry Coleman Scoggin, class of 1961.
Here.
Roy Stanley Skinner, class of 1961.
Here.
Randolph Willard Taylor, class of 1961.
Here.
James E. Van Zant, class of 1961.
Here.
Eddie Otto Van Landingham, class of 1961.
Here.
Colonel David G. Webb, class of 1961.
Here.
Jimmy Ralph Weems, class of 1961.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Donald Allen Williamson, class of 1961.
Here.
Billy Joe Zaleski, class of 1961.
Here.
Gary Allen Batt, class of 1962.
Here.
Travis Lee Booher, class of 1962.
Here.
Dr. Roger Sherwood Botten, class of 1962.
Here.
Robert Davis Caskey, class of 1962.
Here.
Bobby Glenn Cunningham, class of 1962.
Here.
Thomas William Dabney, class of 1962.
Here.
John Peter Dixon, class of 1962.
Here.
Major Ralph W. Dunham, class of 1962.
Here.
Wallace E. Dunks, class of 1962.
Here.
Joe Tom Easley, class of 1962.
Here.
Christopher Farias, class of 1962.
Here.
Alvin Charles Greenberg, class of 1962.
Here.
Bernard J. Hagelin, class of 1962.
Here.
Gerald Clifton Heddens, class of 1962.
Here.
Edgar Lewis Hoke, Jr., class of 1962.
Here.
Dr. Eldred E. Cahey, class of 1962.
Here.
Robert A. Mears, class of 1962.
Here.
Hubert Dwayne Nelson, class of 1962.
Here.
Henry Christopher Ortega, class of 1962.
Here.
Clifford A. Robinson, class of 1962.
Here.
John Ashley Sanders, Sr., class of 1962.
Here.
Gary Lee Santerre, class of 1962.
Here.
Dr. Frank C. Schmalstieg, Jr., class of 1962.
Here.
Charles James Schwertner, class of 1962.
Here.
Dr. Edmund Peter Segner, Jr., class of 1962.
Here.
Larry Park Shepard, class of 1962.
Here.
Dr. Robert Emmett Steger, class of 1962.
Here.
Robert Thomas Sweatman, class of 1962.
Here.
Paul Franklin Van Nieuwenhuis, class of 1962.
Here.
Dr. Charles Edgar Warlick, Jr., class of 1962.
Here.
Richard E. Withers, Jr., class of 1962.
Here.
Ronald Joseph Walney, class of 1962.
Here.
Taylor Wong, class of 1962.
Here.
Dr. Milton Andrus Ainsworth, class of 1963.
Here.
William Hjalmar Brashears, class of 1963.
Here.
Arvin Ernst Brem, class of 1963.
Here.
James W. Carter, class of 1963.
Here.
Kenneth E. Cooner, class of 1963.
Here.
Sanford Dale Cothran, class of 1963.
Here.
Andrew Carnegie Elliott, Jr., class of 1963.
Here.
John Henry Frank, class of 1963.
Here.
Patrick Caldwell Gray, class of 1963.
Here.
Ronald Earl Hendry, class of 1963.
Here.
James Paul Hoffman, class of 1963.
Here.
Don V. Hawley, class of 1963.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Ronald D. Hunter, class of 1963.
Here.
Harry E. Liston, class of 1963.
Here.
James William Maltby, class of 1963.
Here.
Carol Neuville Miller, class of 1963.
Here.
Stephen Gray Moore, class of 1963.
Here.
Colonel David Earl Pearson, class of 1963.
Here.
Lawrence J. Raba, class of 1963.
Here.
Kim Richmond, class of 1963.
Here.
Wesley Aubrey Robinson Sr., class of 1963.
Here.
James Dinsmore Sartwell, Jr., class of 1963.
Here.
Dr. Aubrey Joseph Sarowitz, class of 1963.
Here.
Joseph Bennett Siptek, class of 1963.
Here.
Tom Max Thomas, class of 1963.
Here.
James David Thrasher, class of 1963.
Here.
Gary Kit Voss, class of 1963.
Here.
Michael Neil Walker, class of 1963.
Here.
North Otis West, class of 1963.
Here.
The Spirit of Muster by Joey Dean, class of 2005. For all the Ags who have gone before me, who gave all they had for all I now enjoy, our spirit I faithfully carry forward and try to leave a better world behind. Softly call the muster, Ags, and raise your candlelight. Gone but not forgotten, let him hear that old farmer's fight. Today my voice is yours, as I call here. I stand for fallen heroes, for those I hold most dear.
Colonel Samuel A. Biondo, class of 1964.
Here.
James Robert Bone, Jr., class of 1964.
Here.
Travis Roland Bryce, class of 1964.
Here.
Paul Carroll Cronenberger, class of 1964.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Albert W. Degiansky, class of 1964.
Here.
Frederick Pascal Dwight, class of 1964.
Here.
James Eugene Everett, class of 1964.
Here.
Richard Albert Farquharson, class of 1964.
Here.
James R. Fontaine, class of 1964.
Here.
Morris Albert Fraley, Jr., class of 1964.
Here.
Ray Douglas Freeman, class of 1964.
Here.
Thomas Michael Galloway, class of 1964.
Here.
Paul Allen Getz, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Charles Evans Hammonds, class of 1964.
Here.
Benny Steve Harrington, class of 1964.
Here.
Robert Lee Hip, Jr., class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Roy Alton Jacoby, class of 1964.
Here.
James J. Jenkins, class of 1964.
Here.
Gary Nolan Johnson, class of 1964.
Here.
Randy Melvin Johnson, class of 1964.
Here.
John Lewis Kazda, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Wendell M. Kearney, class of 1964.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Russell Lee Keeling, class of 1964.
Here.
Gary Wayne Kirk, class of 1964.
Here.
Ralph Dean Laywell, class of 1964.
Here.
Jerry Byron Lee, class of 1964.
Here.
Ben E. McCulloch, class of 1964.
Here.
Robert Wayne Mosley, class of 1964.
Here.
Charles Lewis Mueldener, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Alberto Manuel Olivares, class of 1964.
Here.
Daniel Anthony Penaloza, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Charles Pennell, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. James Lee Rogers, class of 1964.
Here.
Richard Rugley Searle, Jr., class of 1964.
Here.
James Harper Sparks, class of 1964.
Here.
Ira Elmo Warren, class of 1964.
Here.
George K. White, class of 1964.
Here.
Robert Wallace Wimbish, class of 1964.
Here.
Jack Walters Wynn, class of 1964.
Here.
Albert William Abel, Jr., class of 1965.
Here.
Kenneth Webster Bratz, class of 1965.
Here.
Frank Joseph Catalina, class of 1965.
Here.
Curtis Allen Flatt, class of 1965.
Here.
Richard Juve Forns, class of 1965.
Here.
Joseph Stanley Britton Jenkins, class of 1965.
Here.
Troy Kenneth Johnson, class of 1965.
Here.
William Russell Ledbetter, Jr., class of 1964.
Here.
James Alvin Laney, class of 1965.
Here.
Mario A. Macaluso, class of 1965.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Ronald Dean Miles, class of 1965.
Here.
Bert Edwin Moritz III, class of 1965.
Here.
Gloria Isaac Morton, class of 1965.
Here.
Shirley Carol Phillips Porter, class of 1965.
Here.
Alex John Quisenberry, class of 1965.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Roy Austin Roberts, class of 1965.
Here.
Carl Lee Rubenstein, class of 1965.
Here.
Jimmy Arnold Rutherford, class of 1965.
Here.
Ronald David Sanford, class of 1965.
Here.
Charles Ray Stedman, Jr., class of 1965.
Here.
Richard Scott Van Pelt, class of 1965.
Here.
William Ray Watts, class of 1965.
Here.
Gary Wayne Williams, class of 1965.
Here.
Stephen John Williams, class of 1965.
Here.
George Eugene Kane, class of 1966.
Here.
William Hardy Calcott, class of 1966.
Here.
Mickey Dwayne Chambliss, class of 1966.
Here.
Raymond James Friedman, class of 1966.
Here.
Jerry Clay Harbert II, class of 1966.
Here.
Franklin Augustus Harris, Jr., class of 1966.
Here.
John L. Hensley, Jr., class of 1966.
Here.
Dr. Darrell Wayne Kennard, class of 1966.
Here.
Dwayne Vessel Nairn, class of 1966.
Here.
William Henry Perry, class of 1966.
Here.
David C. Powell, class of 1966.
Here.
Kenneth Ray Schroeder, class of 1966.
Here.
Richard Dwayne Seitz, class of 1966.
Here.
Dr. William David Tollison, class of 1966.
Here.
Joseph Haller Wellborn, Jr., class of 1966.
Here.
Barry Richard Baker, class of 1967.
Here.
Ira Stanley Bonds, class of 1967.
Here.
Donald Carlton Burleson, Jr., class of 1967.
Here.
Gary Lee Cooley, class of 1967.
Here.
Robert Stiles Dansby, class of 1967.
Here.
Charles Lynn Dodd, class of 1967.
Here.
John Pierce Ellis, class of 1967.
Here.
David Lee Foray, class of 1967.
Here.
Earl F. Gillum, class of 1967.
Here.
Colonel Henry L. Graves, Jr., class of 1967.
Here.
Captain Robert H. Gustafson, class of 1967.
Here.
William Revis Johnson, class of 1967.
Here.
Gary Wayne Kovar Sr., class of 1967.
Here.
Andrew Stephen Kovich Jr., class of 1967.
Here.
Colonel Co. J. Crucy Jr., class of 1967.
Here.
Gordon J. Mayer Jr., class of 1967.
Thomas Charles McPherson, class of 1967.
Here.
Ricardo Meade, class of 1967.
Here.
Wayne Charles Meyer, class of 1967.
Here.
Robert Frank Pinnock, Jr., class of 1967.
Here.
Max Floyd Roundtree, class of 1967.
Here.
Jimmy Curtis Savage, class of 1967.
Here.
William Fairchild Slinner, class of 1967.
Here.
Colonel Michael Ray Seal, class of 1967.
Here.
Jerry G. Taylor, class of 1967.
Here.
Dr. Joe D. Townsend, class of 1967.
Here.
Dr. Jack Michael Willoughby, class of 1967.
Here.
Colonel John Robert Weiss, class of 1967.
Here.
William Blair Anderton, class of 1968.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel James R. Brady, class of 1968.
Here.
The Honorable Albert H. Cobb, class of 1968.
Here.
Kenneth C. Kramer Jr., class of 1968. Ronald Bevington Davis, class of 1968. Dr. Walter A. Deutsch, class of 1968. Kenneth Allen Dooley, class of 1968. Dr. Clayton Gary Dye, class of 1968. Terry Allen Elliott, class of 1968. Carl Vincent Fiducia, class of 1968. John T. Frege, class of 1968. Robert McReynolds Galladay II, class of 1968. Colonel Kelvin J. Kelkenberg, class of 1968. Billy Wayne Lee, class of 1968. John Edward Meyer, class of 1968. Jack Rousseau Nickel, class of 1968. Stephen Albert Offenhauser, class of 1968. Dennis Roy Parrish, class of 1968. Dr. Paula Dortho Rouse, class of 1968. James Lynn Reeder, class of 1968. Horace Randall Roberts, class of 1968. James Lynn Ryan, class of 1968. Edward Lane Stavanoa, class of 1968. Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Norman Thompson, class of 1968. Roy B. Young, class of 1968. James William Becker, class of 1969. M.Z. Ray Boehm, class of 1969. Dr. Ben Lee Carnes, class of 1969. Dr. Thomas W. Clapp, class of 1969. Willie Charles Cook, class of 1969. Frank Davis III, class of 1969. Michael Lynn Dykey, class of 1969. Billy Jack Dobbins, class of 1969.
Larry W. Deppenschmidt, class of 1969. Terry King Fleming, class of 1969. Charles Edwards Gibbs II, class of 1969. Dennis Jarrett Gwill, class of 1969. Thomas Walker Hewitt, class of 1969. William Ellery Howard, class of 1969. Joe Wesley Curley, class of 1969. Guy Wilkins LaFleur III, class of 1969. Frank Scott Lightoff, class of 1969. Joe William Lyles, class of 1969.
Here.
Thad Reagan Moore, class of 1969.
Here.
James Evans Murphy, class of 1969.
Here.
Rory Henry New, class of 1969.
Here.
Larry Lynn Oakes, class of 1969.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Robert Coulter Olson, Jr., class of 1969.
Here.
Carl Randall Parker, class of 1969.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Richard L. Poling, class of 1969.
Here.
Clarence Henry Reeves, class of 1969.
Here.
Michael S. Richard, class of 1969.
Here.
Stephen Hanson Sharpless, class of 1969.
Here.
Dr. Charles P. Turco, class of 1969.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Kennard Smith Vandergriff, Jr., class of 1969.
Here.
Charles Wayne Wallace, class of 1969.
Here.
William Maxwell Watts, Jr., class of 1969.
Here.
Dr. Charles H. Wentz, class of 1969.
Here.
Alan David Alter, class of 1970.
Here.
Dr. Joe Frederick Bennett, class of 1970.
Here.
Charles Andrew Cates, class of 1970.
Here.
Ronald Louis Chacher, class of 1970.
Here.
Melvin Bryce Cadeau, class of 1970.
Here.
Judith Reeves Comstock, class of 1970.
Here.
Clara May Couser, class of 1970.
Here.
John R. Druian, class of 1970.
Here.
Ellen Wells Ellison, class of 1970.
Here.
William E. Franzen, class of 1970.
Here.
Harvey Lewis Frells, class of 1970.
Here.
Benedict Paul Giusti, Jr., class of 1970.
Here.
Colonel Michael Gregory Gakin, class of 1970.
Here.
Dr. Henry Wesley Griffin, class of 1970.
Here.
Donald Douglas Hale, class of 1970.
Here.
Major Alan James Henderson, Jr., class of 1970.
Here.
Frank Edward A. Bear, Sr., class of 1970.
Here.
Captain Calvin Charles Hunziker, Jr., class of 1970.
Here.
Curtis A. Laudermilk, class of 1970.
Here.
Dean Allen Lilly, class of 1970.
Here.
Frank Monteblano III, class of 1970.
Here.
David Wayne Morris, class of 1970.
Here.
Marilyn Yvonne Owens, class of 1970.
Here.
Dr. Stephen Michael Prescott, class of 1970.
Here.
Oliver Wayne Sadberry, Jr., class of 1970.
Here.
George Xavier Smystrola, Jr., class of 1970.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Albert Hamilton Tribe, Jr., class of 1970.
Here.
John E. Wilkins III, class of 1970.
Here.
Weldon Van Wilson, class of 1970.
Here.
Olivia Gay Wilkin, class of 1970.
Here.
James Eugene Wood, class of 1970.
Here.
Dr. Sweekie Arliss Anderson, class of 1971.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Charles Victor Brown, class of 1971.
Here.
Stephen Randolph Bryant, class of 1971.
Here.
Dr. Ernest Edwin Davis, class of 1971.
Here.
Jane Wexler Hollywell, class of 1971.
Here.
Willard Bryan Johnson, Sr., class of 1971.
Here.
Dr. William Carroll Johnson, class of 1971.
Here.
David Merrill Lachette, class of 1971.
Here.
Dr. Joe T. Locke, class of 1971.
Here.
Brenda Doreen McGuire, class of 1971.
Here.
Frederick Eugene Morrill, Jr., class of 1971.
Here.
Robert John O'Leary, class of 1971.
Here.
James C. Pyle, class of 1971.
Here.
Charles Daniel Riesenover, class of 1971.
Here.
Dr. James Wilson Rundell, class of 1971.
Here.
Roger Leah Smith, class of 1971.
Here.
Captain Barker Holmes Story, class of 1971.
Here.
Charles Thomas Villarosa, class of 1971.
Here.
Stephen Colwell Voss, class of 1971.
Here.
George Stanley Week, class of 1971.
Here.
Alan Richard Anderson, class of 1972.
Here.
Sherman W. Barnowski, class of 1972.
Here.
Timothy M. Collins, class of 1972.
Here.
William Buddy Collins, class of 1972.
Here.
Tony Jim Caruso, class of 1972.
Here.
Larry Allen Davis, class of 1972.
Here.
Raymond Victor DiMilano, class of 1972.
Here.
Michael Duane Donegan, class of 1972.
Here.
Roger J. Garnsney, class of 1972.
Here.
James W. Hubert, class of 1972.
Here.
Mark Edward King, class of 1972.
Here.
Raymond Henry Kapatski, Jr., class of 1972.
Here.
Stephen Victor Labib, class of 1972.
Here.
Dwayne Lovinggood, class of 1972.
Here.
Dr. Melvin Albert Newman, class of 1972.
Here.
Barbara Love W. No, class of 1972.
Here.
Dwayne Bradford Nygren, class of 1972.
Here.
David Homer Reddy, class of 1972.
Here.
Edward James Schmeltz, class of 1972.
Here.
Carl Frank Schneider Jr., class of 1972.
Here.
Captain William Wayne Smith, class of 1972.
Here.
Ross Earl Stansel, class of 1972.
Here.
Henry Jacob Lucher Stark II, class of 1972.
Here.
Lyle Thomas Stein, class of 1972.
Here.
Gregory Lee Trimble, class of 1972.
Here.
Donnie Vance Yates, class of 1972.
Here.
O. Mark Anthony, class of 1973.
Here.
Terry W. Bond, class of 1973.
Here.
Robert Jarvis Butler, class of 1973.
Here.
William George Derwacher, class of 1973.
Here.
Michael E. Flynn, class of 1973.
Here.
Jody Paschal Godwin, class of 1973.
Here.
Dr. William Henry Hall, class of 1973.
Here.
Dr. Don Douglas Householder, class of 1973.
Here.
Stephen Patrick Kirkpatrick, class of 1973.
Here.
Bobby Eugene Mayfield, class of 1973.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Wood Nunley, class of 1973.
Here.
Oscar Kenneth Oates, class of 1973.
Here.
Roger Dale Schronk, class of 1973.
Here.
Larry Thomas Taff, class of 1973.
Here.
Emma Jo Elizabeth Jordan Wallace, class of 1973.
Here.
George Bernard Alden Jr., class of 1974.
Here.
Thomas D. Arnold, class of 1974.
Here.
Robert Craig Barker, class of 1974.
Here.
Calvin Paul Croker, class of 1974.
Here.
Norman Richard Egan, class of 1974.
Here.
Malcolm Owen Everett, class of 1974.
Here.
Forrest Allen Futrell, class of 1974.
Here.
Noel Benton Gatliff, class of 1974.
Here.
William Grady Groves, class of 1974.
Here.
Charles Eugene Harbich, class of 1974.
Here.
Lawrence Wesley Havard, Sr., class of 1974.
Here.
George Martin Herzog, Jr., class of 1974.
Here.
Frank Edison Lassiter, Jr., class of 1974.
Here.
John Michael Lilly, class of 1974.
Here.
Barbara Diane Brown McDermott, class of 1974.
Here.
Commander John Keogh Primer, Sr., class of 1974.
Here.
Alfred E. Pronger III, class of 1974.
Here.
Julio Science, Jr., class of 1974.
Here.
Don Edward Self, class of 1974.
Here.
Gerald Malin Stormer, class of 1974.
Here.
Dr. Altrick Ruth Tomlin, class of 1974.
Here.
Thomas Lynn Winstein, class of 1974.
Here.
Dr. Robert Ed Whitson, class of 1974.
Here.
Stephen Ray Young, class of 1974.
Here.
Vernon Ray Aldridge, class of 1975.
Here.
Charles Parnell Amrock II, class of 1975.
Here.
Lori Angel, class of 1975.
Here.
Charles G. Arnold, class of 1975.
Here.
Stephen Scott Baggett, class of 1975.
Here.
Dr. David Norman Chancellor, class of 1975.
Here.
George Edward Chase, Jr., class of 1975.
Here.
Verland Lee Granberry, class of 1975.
Here.
James Scott Hattelstad, class of 1975.
Here.
Glenn Ray Coons, class of 1975.
Here.
John Russell Payne, class of 1975.
Here.
Mark David Rankin, class of 1975.
Here.
M. Lynette Cheatham Rowland, class of 1975.
Here.
Charlotte A. Sherbel, class of 1975.
Here.
Alan Wilson Schmidt, class of 1975.
Here.
Margaret N. Stevenson, class of 1975.
Here.
James William Stroud III, class of 1975.
Here.
Michael Henry Visosky, class of 1975.
Here.
Edward Nelson Whitley Jr., class of 1975.
Here.
Leroy Billington, class of 1976.
Here.
Dr. Edwin Taylor Boyer, class of 1976.
Here.
Roy Clyde Burns, class of 1976.
Here.
Dr. Donald Lee Elfert, class of 1976.
Here.
Lawrence Michael Frank, class of 1976.
Here.
Jesse George Jr., class of 1976.
Here.
Dennis John Graham, class of 1976.
Here.
Mark Douglas Gray, class of 1976.
Here.
Charles Anderson Hinton Jr., class of 1976.
Here.
James Lloyd Ivy, class of 1976.
Here.
Michael Charles Kruger, class of 1976.
Here.
Thomas Arthur Little Jr., class of 1976.
Here.
Glenn Jameson Miller, class of 1976.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Robert Lauren Miller, class of 1976.
Here.
Patricia A. Montgomery, class of 1976.
Here.
Theron Elliott Mund, class of 1976.
Here.
Diane P. Afinger, class of 1976.
Here.
Edward Christian Afinger, class of 1976.
Here.
Karen June Pfeiffer, class of 1976.
Here.
Dr. Mark William Riggs, class of 1976.
Here.
Benjamin James Schertz, class of 1976.
Here.
Dr. Cecil Fred Turner, class of 1976.
Here.
Wilson Joel Urbanke, class of 1976.
Here.
Patrick Newton Warren, class of 1976.
Here.
Linda Darlene Whitley, class of 1976.
Here.
Francisco Javier Aguirre, Jr., class of 1977.
Here.
Thomas Alfred Colbert, class of 1977.
Here.
James A. Diven, class of 1977.
Here.
Mary Jane Fitzgerald, class of 1977.
Here.
Robert Terrell Gebert, class of 1977.
Here.
Michael Kelly Gunter, class of 1977.
Here.
Patricia Ann Burke Hiller, class of 1977.
Here.
Sandra Lee Halavacek, class of 1977.
Here.
William Joseph Hughes, Jr., class of 1977.
Here.
Joanne Judas, class of 1977.
Here.
David Lee Keese, class of 1977.
Here.
Donnie A. Kiker, class of 1977.
Here.
Bruce B. Monroe, class of 1977.
Here.
William Lewis Mastia, Jr., class of 1977.
Here.
Sarah Aaron Bodie Neal, class of 1977.
Here.
William F. Rayleigh, class of 1977.
Here.
William H. Rather, class of 1977.
Here.
Kenneth F. Robson, class of 1977.
Here.
Jose Luis Santillan, class of 1977.
Here.
Lane B. Stevenson, class of 1977.
Here.
Curtis Edward Waldrop, class of 1977.
Here.
James Marion White, class of 1977.
Here.
Simon Zalman, class of 1977.
Here.
Paul Carroll Bartlett, Jr., class of 1978.
Here.
Jerome Edwin Clary, Jr., class of 1978.
Here.
John H. Cochran III, class of 1978.
Here.
Richard Thomas Epwright, class of 1978.
Here.
Commander Travis L. King, Jr., class of 1978.
Here.
Rex Warren Kyle, class of 1978.
Here.
Wilbur Joseph Laughlin, class of 1978.
Here.
Richard Ramirez Rosas, class of 1978.
Here.
Richard Morgan Sanders, Jr., class of 1978.
Here.
Dr. Eric Craig Shepard, class of 1978.
Here.
Edwin Ray Templeton, class of 1978.
Here.
Alejandro Ibarra Torres, class of 1978.
Here.
Dr. William Leonard Vandergrift, class of 1978.
Here.
Douglas J. Wild, class of 1978.
Here.
Dr. Aditi Kumar Anjaruza, class of 1979.
Here.
John Dennis Beverly, class of 1979.
Here.
William Hartnell Blue, class of 1979.
Here.
Douglas Ray Bryan, class of 1979.
Here.
Jim Witten Bryan, class of 1979.
Here.
Linda Gay Cornelius, class of 1979.
Here.
Joseph Earl Davis II, class of 1979.
Here.
Dr. Paul Lindsay Fisher, class of 1979.
Here.
Angela Ruzick Hammond, class of 1979.
Here.
Michael Thomas Henry, class of 1979.
Here.
Dr. Nancy Lee Holland, class of 1979.
Here.
Wayne C. Morby, class of 1979.
Here.
Dennis Wayne Nickel, class of 1979.
Here.
David Cowden Ogden, class of 1979.
Here.
Susan Claire Scott Reeves, class of 1979.
Here.
Jeffrey G. Reed, class of 1979.
Here.
Dennis James Seth, class of 1979.
Here.
Mark Patrick Terry, class of 1979.
Here.
Bernice Anderson Thompson, class of 1979.
Here.
Stand for Me by Patricia Bell Millsap, class of 1979.
Here.
Will you stand for me at muster when I leave this earthly plane? Will you answer for me clearly when they call out my name? Will you speak of me a time or two when Aggies gather round, especially at a football game at Cal Field's hallowed ground? If you can do these things for me, I'll know I'm still a part of the school and friends I leave behind that I fill this Aggie's heart.
Thomas George Williams Jr., class of 1979.
Here.
Matthew Allen Williamson, class of 1979.
Here.
Cheryl Robin Abbott, class of 1980.
Here.
Michael R. Barker, class of 1980.
Here.
Keith Randall Bell, class of 1980.
Here.
Marvin Ernest Chernovsky Jr., class of 1980.
Here.
Roy James Fitzwater, class of 1980.
Here.
Beverly Wilson Gaynor, class of 1980.
Here.
Molly Ann Higgins, class of 1980.
Here.
Carl David Huckabee, class of 1980.
Here.
Warren R. Yonke, class of 1980.
Here.
Melinda Jane Jordan, class of 1980.
Here.
David Eugene Kite, class of 1980.
Here.
Donna Lynn Malmberg, class of 1980.
Here.
Charles James Montoya, class of 1980.
Here.
Dr. Evelyn C. Spears, class of 1980.
Here.
John Thomas Tengler, class of 1980.
Here.
Edward Bruce Wilson, class of 1980.
Here.
William J. Atzenhofer, class of 1981.
Here.
Robert Owen Bond, class of 1981.
Here.
Dale C. Benura, class of 1981.
Here.
Brent Marshall Brentzel, class of 1981.
Here.
Philip Glenn Bowie, class of 1981.
Here.
Captain Arturo Campos Jr., class of 1981.
Here.
Bruce Victor Clark, class of 1981.
Here.
Judy K. Eberhardt, class of 1981.
Here.
Theodore Allen Etchison, class of 1981.
Here.
Yui Sing Fan, class of 1981.
Here.
Donald Edgar Fitzgerald, class of 1981.
Here.
Narciso R. Garza, Jr., class of 1981.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Wiley C. Gilmore, class of 1981.
Here.
Christy Simmons Glorfeld, class of 1981.
Here.
Amelia Ann Hall, class of 1981.
Here.
Kelly Lynn Murley, class of 1981.
Here.
Gay Lynn Collins O'Connor, class of 1981.
Here.
Stephen Scott Pennington, class of 1981.
Here.
Major Manuel Wayne Robinson, class of 1981.
Here.
Mark Eric Roth, class of 1981.
Here.
Dr. Marilyn Marick Schrewer, class of 1981.
Here.
Marlon Gregory Schumann, class of 1981.
Here.
Diana Nunez Stark, class of 1981.
Here.
Myron James Thompson, class of 1981.
Here.
Christopher Lynn Weaver, class of 1981.
Here.
Penny Wilkinson, class of 1981.
Here.
David Wayne Warlow, class of 1981.
Here.
Dr. Alfonso Zapata, class of 1981.
Here.
Terry D. Thomas Angonia, class of 1981.
Here.
Ronald Earl Barlow, class of 1982.
Here.
Elsa G. Beal, class of 1982.
Here.
Kelly Jan Cannon, class of 1982.
Here.
Johnny Doyle Combs, class of 1982.
Here.
Stephen Kennan Davis, class of 1982.
Here.
James Ashley Ellis, Jr., class of 1982.
Here.
Michael Ernest Irwin, class of 1982.
Here.
Dr. Robert Feinstein, class of 1982.
Here.
William Laney Furr, class of 1982.
Here.
Elizabeth A. Govendick, class of 1982.
Here.
Joseph L. Mashburn, class of 1982.
Here.
J. Michael Massey, class of 1982.
Here.
Donald Kent Miller, class of 1982.
Here.
Dorothy Jill Mossbarger, class of 1982.
Here.
Kyle Stewart Newcomb, class of 1982.
Here.
Jerry Wayne Nystrom, class of 1982.
Here.
William Mark Price, class of 1982.
Here.
Charles Albert Rentz, Jr., class of 1982.
Here.
Mark Stephen Sanders, class of 1982.
Here.
Dr. Gary K. Zehe, class of 1982.
Here.
Alan Scott Armstrong, class of 1983.
Here.
William Terrell Acock IV, class of 1983.
Here.
Kirk Randall Barron, class of 1983.
Here.
Jerry William Chevalier, class of 1983.
Here.
Randy Theodore Cooper, class of 1983.
Here.
Charles M. Crawford, class of 1983.
Here.
Basil Landon Hoyle, Jr., class of 1983.
Here.
Leo John Hudson, class of 1983.
Here.
William R. Hughes, class of 1983.
Here.
Laura Lee Hurley, class of 1983.
Here.
Colonel Mark A. Huron, class of 1983.
Here.
Timothy John Jameson, class of 1983.
Here.
Pamela Lee Lesner, class of 1983.
Here.
John Charles Moody, class of 1983.
Here.
Dr. Terry J. Oberg, class of 1983.
Here.
Denise Ann Richter, class of 1983.
Here.
Reverend George Wilford Sanders, Jr., class of 1983.
Here.
Dr. Daniel Lee Simpson, class of 1983.
Here.
Laura Lee McConnell Weber, class of 1983.
Here.
Jeffrey Allen Wayland, class of 1983.
Here.
Captain Jeffrey Charles Whitaker, class of 1983.
Here.
Michael Edgen Wills, class of 1983.
Here.
Rex Bradford Arnold, class of 1984.
Here.
Lieutenant Commander Douglas Glass Benefield, class of 1984.
Here.
Michael Joseph Bennett, class of 1984.
Here.
Dr. Lydia Ann Bishop, class of 1984.
Here.
Andrew G. Costin, class of 1984.
Here.
Dr. Jose Luis Diaz Martinez, class of 1984.
Here.
Aaron Ernest Friesenhan, class of 1984.
Here.
Shelley K. Starnes Garner, class of 1984.
Here.
Matthew Jess Gilland, class of 1984.
Here.
Melinda Jan Keels, class of 1984.
Here.
Larry William Kenneda, class of 1984.
Here.
Millard J. Kirby, class of 1984.
Here.
Daniel Franklin Knupp, class of 1984.
Here.
Suzanne Werner Kramer, class of 1984.
Here.
Dr. David Brian Landrum, class of 1984.
Here.
Michael Leroy Maciel, class of 1984.
Here.
Cole Anthony Morvan, class of 1984.
Here.
Dr. Wayne Peckham, class of 1984.
Here.
Daniel Wayne Peach, class of 1984.
Here.
Lawrence Holker Potts, Jr., class of 1984.
Here.
Michael Dwayne Rudine, class of 1984.
Here.
James Kent Schuster, class of 1984.
Here.
Robert Waldron Shine, class of 1984.
Here.
David Charles Snyder, class of 1984.
Here.
William J. Teckel, class of 1984.
Here.
Jerry Ann McGee Whiteacre, class of 1984.
Here.
Dr. Robert Owen Zimmerman, class of 1984.
Here.
Edmund Craig Arenga, class of 1985.
Here.
Donna Jean Benz, class of 1985.
Here.
Tammy Elise Boss, class of 1985.
Here.
Dean Andrew Hamke, class of 1985.
Here.
Mary Elizabeth Barzak Higginbotham, class of 1985.
Here.
Edmund Marcinkowicz, Jr., class of 1985.
Here.
Dr. Lyle Blaine McCurdy, class of 1985.
Here.
David L. Miller, class of 1985.
Here.
John Sal Muncy, class of 1985.
Here.
James Wilson Smiley, class of 1985.
Here.
D. Warren Sumner, class of 1985.
Here.
Stephen Dale Thompson, class of 1985.
Here.
Dina Leanne Brown Tobler, class of 1985.
Here.
Gwendolyn Rayburn Abshire, class of 1986.
Here.
Flynn James Adcock, class of 1986.
Here.
Dr. John DeArmond Armstrong, class of 1986.
Here.
John David Booth, class of 1986.
Here.
Ken Wilburn Browning, class of 1986.
Here.
Todd Meadows Davis, class of 1986.
Here.
Dr. Ronald P. DeVecchio, class of 1986.
Here.
Dr. Susan E. Dollar, class of 1986.
Here.
David Mark Ing, class of 1986.
Here.
Lori Lee Heidelbreder Garrett, class of 1986.
Here.
Thomas Henry Grease, class of 1986.
Here.
Gary Dwayne Hale, class of 1986.
Here.
Cheryl Ann Henry, class of 1986.
Here.
Dr. Daniel Franklin Jennings, class of 1986.
Here.
Mary Catherine Martin, class of 1986.
Here.
Kevin Henson McIntosh, class of 1986.
Here.
Lyman John Neefer III, class of 1986.
Here.
William Lawrence Raba, class of 1986.
Here.
Craig Allen Smith, class of 1986.
Here.
Christina J. Stanton, class of 1986.
Here.
David Charles Steele, class of 1986.
Here.
Florence Sulia Yancey Stewart, class of 1986.
Here.
Cynthia K. Mathey Tabor, class of 1986.
Here.
Dr. Daniel Edwin Wegner, class of 1986.
Here.
Laura E. Clark Weiss, class of 1986.
Here.
Paul Wayne Allen, class of 1987.
Here.
Gary Lee Almquist, class of 1987.
Here.
Lori Lynn Carell, class of 1987.
Here.
Marshall Allen DeVita, class of 1987.
Here.
Ginger L. DeRill, class of 1987.
Here.
Jeffrey Dale Hill, class of 1987. Valerie Lynn Hoerman, class of 1987. Stephanie Carol Lanier, class of 1987. Peter Rayner Manhard, class of 1987. Marcus H. McMillan, class of 1987. Brian Paul Murphy, class of 1987. Kenneth Brian Noakes, class of 1987. Randy Wayne Ray, class of 1987. John Carlton Rowan, class of 1987. Mark Allen Sossaman, class of 1987. Janina Elaine Womble, class of 1987. Stuart Todd Burton, class of 1988. David Michael Davenport, class of 1988. Timothy Larry Dungan, class of 1988. Ronald Scott Farrar, class of 1988. Catherine Janice Greenwade, class of 1988. Talitha Lee Guarnieri, class of 1988. Michelle Marie DeVoe McIntyre, class of 1988. Sarah E. Mitchell, class of 1988. Kuang Nguyen, class of 1988.
Dr. Stephen P. Owens, class of 1988. Albert Sandoval, class of 1988. Robert Randall Schleicher, class of 1988. Craig Lemur Tilford, senior, class of 1988. Robin Ray Tipton, class of 1988. Stephen Wade Watley, class of 1988. Dr. Martin Leon Bennett, class of 1989. Darren Paul Busker, class of 1989. Smith Wally Hartley, class of 1989. Amy Michelle McCormick, class of 1989. Thomas Michael McGraw, class of 1989. Eric J. Mulligan, class of 1989. Dr. Ann S. Thomas, class of 1989. Suzanne Lynn Young, class of 1989. Michael J. Aspinall, class of 1990. Keith Wayne Bayer, class of 1990. Colonel Ricardo Martinez, class of 1990. Shannon Smith, class of 1990. Michael Tanner Wright, class of 1990. Priscilla Ann York, class of 1990. Helen Goodwin On, class of 1991. Terry Ann Alexander, class of 1991. Reverend Melissa Martin Booth, class of 1991. Colonel Michael Wayne Cobb, class of 1991. Eric Givylance, class of 1991. Thomas White Kessler III, class of 1991. William Joseph Kowalski, class of 1991. Manuel V. Lafont, class of 1991. Stephen Michael Martinez, class of 1991. Martha Faye McRae, class of 1991.
William R. Orange, Jr., class of 1991. Joanna Orsock Pate, class of 1991. Stephen Lawrence Scully, class of 1991. Kyle Neems Winkle, class of 1991. Jeffrey Kendall Cohen, class of 1992. Howard Allen Cook, class of 1992. Jeffrey Walter Herms, class of 1992. Dr. John David Jenkin, class of 1992. James Boyd Lapp, class of 1992. Matthew Stephen Shugart, class of 1992. Robert A. Bodema, class of 1993. Leanne Dolan Coward, class of 1993. Dr. Todd Randall Ehrlich, class of 1993. Derek Barnes Greer, class of 1993. Deborah Lynn Kaiser, class of 1993. Tanya Alicia Lewis, class of 1993. Dr. J. Arline Patterson, class of 1993. Grady Herbert Quick, class of 1993. Jerry R. Rivas, Jr., class of 1993. Aaron Andrew Sauge, class of 1993. Julie O'Rear Wilson, class of 1993. Russell Allen Wilson, class of 1993. Robert Wayne Crouch, class of 1994. Margaret Kirksey Daly, class of 1994. Bradford Eugene Dunham, class of 1994. Lee Rainey Ellis, class of 1994. Kelly Jeanette Rayleigh Franklin, class of 1994. Aura Silvera Gramala, class of 1994. Shelley Lynn Herthneck, class of 1994. Wendell Lynn Kang, class of 1994.
Leona Faye Kopecki Rapstein, class of 1994. Jelaine Mary Mays, class of 1994. Dr. Carolyn Emmett Marshall, class of 1994. Michael S. Mason, class of 1994. Scott Richard Miller, class of 1994. Stephen Donald Moore, class of 1994. Tony Norsworthy, class of 1994. Paul William Owen, class of 1994. Dr. Janice Suzette Welty Petrie, class of 1994. Robert John Roberts, Jr., class of 1994. Arturo Jose Sabarzo, class of 1994. Dr. Elisha Elaine Williams King, class of 1994. Eric Franklin Adcock, class of 1995. Mia Christine Balco, class of 1995. Mark Arnold Batts, class of 1995. Lawrence Christian Coleman, class of 1995. John Eric Englehart, class of 1995. Richard Brad Hargrave, class of 1995. William Ray Harris, Jr., class of 1995. Dr. Robert David Langley, Jr., class of 1995. Matthew Lee Miller, class of 1995. John Charles Mullen, class of 1995. Michelle A. Reynolds, class of 1995. David Wayne Russell, class of 1995. Dr. Melanie C. Bartek, class of 1996. Ronald W. Davis, class of 1996. Jeffrey Jack Gerla, class of 1996. Tommy Wayne Hoyt, class of 1996. Sharon Ann Ludwig Lindholm, class of 1996. Veronica Lee Vaughn McNew, class of 1996.
Christopher R. Narayanan,
class of 1996.
Here.
Andrea Lee Potts, class of 1996.
Here.
Harold Davis Powell III, class of 1996.
Here.
Jonathan Merrill Balmos, class of 1997.
Here.
Dr. Stephen Kenny Chimatali, class of 1997.
Here.
Kevin L. Durham, class of 1997.
Here.
Manuel de Jesus Gonzalez III, class of 1997.
Here.
James Matthew Peter Hughes, class of 1997.
Here.
Jennifer Parsons Laporte, class of 1997.
Here.
Kimberly Ann Tucker, class of 1997.
Here.
Felicia Oshibi Washington, class of 1997.
Here.
Dr. James Lester True, class of 1997.
Here.
Ryan Beach Barton, class of 1998.
Here.
Leonardo Adelbert Calloway II, class of 1998.
Here.
Dr. Ezekiel Mazwe Chimbabi, class of 1998.
Here.
John Kirby Litton, class of 1998.
Here.
Andrew Wallace Olin, class of 1998.
Here.
Deborah Villarreal Turpin, class of 1998.
Here.
James Bradley Alcorn, class of 1999.
Here.
Jeffrey Austin Dyke, class of 1999.
Here.
Travis Fontaine Erskine, class of 1999.
Here.
James Michael Light, class of 1999.
Here.
Victoria Irene Pons, class of 1999.
Here.
The Honorable Kevin L. Ward, class of 1999.
Here.
Garrett Craig Chupik, class of 2000.
Here.
Reed Bowling Hickson, class of 2000.
Here.
Dr. Margaret McFadden Milliken, class of 2000.
Here.
Greg Allen Pate, class of 2000.
Here.
Brian Christopher Pickett, class of 2000.
Here.
Jessica Sands Rad, class of 2000.
Here.
Melissa Blakeney Reich, class of 2000.
Here.
Rhoda Danielle Seeger, class of 2000.
Here.
April A. Williams, class of 2000.
Here.
Ginger Elaine Younts, class of 2000.
Here.
James Browning Aiken, class of 2001.
Here.
David Wayne Bellamy, Jr., class of 2001.
Here.
Jonathan Scott Enderly, class of 2001.
Here.
Dr. Thomas R. Casari, class of 2001.
Here.
Benjamin Eduardo Macias, class of 2001.
Here.
Mary Catherine Wilburn Mayo, class of 2001.
Here.
Michael Allen Nicholson, class of 2001.
Here.
Lynn Allison Rust, class of 2001.
Here.
Ryan Eric Taylor, class of 2001.
Here.
Daniel Allen Loggins, class of 2002.
Here.
Theodore James Rawling, class of 2002.
Here.
Scott B. Shepard, class of 2002.
Here.
Dr. Tyson Wayne Wallace, class of 2002.
Here.
Davy Luann Allen, class of 2003.
Here.
Christopher Jason Enderly, class of 2003.
Here.
David Wesley Jarrett, class of 2003.
Here.
Scott M. Lanfried, class of 2003.
Here.
Erica Diane Mauser, class of 2003.
Here.
Dr. Jennifer Cheney Parker, class of 2003.
Here.
Angela Marie Schroeder, class of 2003.
Here.
Jason Alexander Cerna, class of 2003.
Here.
Christopher Todd Jenkins, class of 2004.
Here.
David Malcolm Williams, class of 2004.
Here.
Russell Hugh Adkins, class of 2005.
Here.
Charles Andrew Beal, class of 2005. Jennifer Bordeaux Ross, class of 2005.
Brett Austin Smith, class of 2005. Max Bear Ingram, class of 2006. Chad Earl Mizell, class of 2006. Jared Seth Carter, class of 2007. Amanda Jane Nethery, class of 2007. Eric William Blacka, class of 2008. Ryan Mitchell Horn, class of 2008. Stephen Colin Meyer, class of 2008. Lewis Reinhardt Sanders, class of 2008. Douglas John Angiel, class of 2009. Preston Wayne Anzi, class of 2009. Michael James Rendon, class of 2009. Jennifer Elaine Dornbos, class of 2010. Jordan Battersby McDonald, class of 2010. Scott Hayden Pegram, class of 2010. Mary Jane Shields David, class of 2011. Travis Wyatt Harrell, class of 2011. Anne Arundel Locker Thaddeus, class of 2011. Ethan Thomas Lord, class of 2011. Adam Richard Palchek, class of 2011.
Father Ryan Andrew Stawase, class of 2011. Brian Ray Wilganowski, class of 2011. Catherine Amelia Hernandez, class of 2012. Thomas Ryan Machigimba, class of 2012. Dermont Lehrman Powers, class of 2012. Bain Paul Smith, class of 2012. Andrew Jordan Butler, class of 2013. Matthew Dylan Gabori, class of 2013. Desmond Jamar Gardner, class of 2013. Jade McDonald Scott, class of 2013. John Austin Banks, class of 2014. David Anthony Fabian, class of 2014. Stephanie Lynn Gatika, class of 2014. Kyle Richard Gonzalez, class of 2014. Janelle Lisek Jocelyn, class of 2014. Taylor Marie Birmingham, class of 2015. Kimberly Ann Wells DeRose, class of 2015. Brittany Marling Dio, class of 2015.
Albert Cale Gallatin, class of 2015. David Wesley Kerr, class of 2015. Dion Christopher Lindor, class of 2015. Zachary Lloyd Fellman, class of 2016. Sarah Margaret Solis, class of 2016. Here. William Arturo Argueta, class of 2017. Taylor Mackenzie Dyson, class of 2017. Samantha Joe Holly, class of 2017. Tia Latrell Jones, class of 2017. Brett Andrew Steinman, class of 2017. Mohammed Nasser Omer, class of 2018. Dr. Gregory Allen Garrett, class of 2019. Austin Grant Armstrong, class of 2020. Theron Thomas Brown, class of 2020. Bailey Cole Gully, class of 2020. Jacob Towns Harden, class of 2020.
Here.
Noel Christine Levantino, class of 2020.
Here.
Gerald Michael Lewis, class of 2020. Here. Paul Stutz, class of 2020.
Here.
Earl Clifford Butler IV, class of 2021.
Here.
Andrew James Hubert, class of 2021.
Here.
Dr. William John Seeger, class of 2021.
Here.
Rocky Setiowan, class of 2021.
Here.
Trey Jordan Steen, class of 2021.
Here.
Jeffrey Adam Doro, class of 2022.
Here.
Harrison Miller Fuller, class of 2022.
Here.
Kimberly Nicole Hartfield, class of 2022.
Here.
Justin Ray P. Maktubo, class of 2022.
Here.
Devin Joe Sebastian, class of 2022.
Here.
Bardi Bagu Shahani, class of 2022.
Here.
Jacob Hayden Young, class of 2022.
Here.
Josh Cameron Bowerly, class of 2023.
Here.
Brittany Gail Gavitt, class of 2023.
Here.
Jason Robert Gentry, class of 2023.
Here.
Miranda Elizabeth Meckel, class of 2023.
Here.
Kirsten Catherine Huero, class of 2024.
Here.
David James McLeod, class of 2024.
Here.
Samantha Lee Melanson, class of 2024.
Here.
Chance M. Gibson, class of 2025.
Here.
Weston Allen Miller, class of 2025.
Here.
The next segment of the worldwide roll call for the absent includes Aggies whose deaths that were reported to the association after April 12th, followed by honored faculty, staff, and friends of Texas A&M.
William Buchanan Wilson, class of 1940.
Here.
George Stapp Halfin, class of 1944.
Here.
Albert Maverick McNeil, Jr., class of 1949.
Here.
Don Morris Webb, class of 1950.
Here.
Bobby Lee Ricklick, class of 1954.
Here.
Walter Lancidel Crandall, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Francel Madison Graves, class of 1955.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Frank Richard Forsyth, Jr., class of 1958.
Here.
Sidney William Cawthorn, class of 1960.
Here.
Billy H. Wagner, class of 1961.
Here.
Charles Russell Land, class of 1963.
Here.
Sally Ann Carlisle Griffin, class of 1968.
Here.
Dr. Harold Clonce Clark, Jr., class of 1970.
Here.
Larry Wayne Eon, class of 1970.
Here.
Dr. Alan M. Fisherman, class of 1971.
Here.
Dr. Paul Allen Siebert, class of 1972.
Here.
Jody Bernard Roden, class of 1973.
Here.
Alvin R. Walker, class of 1976.
Here.
Tommy Michael Wilson, class of 1978.
Here.
Brenda Davis, class of 1979.
Here.
William David Medding, class of 1980.
Here.
Daniel Ray Clodfelder, class of 1982.
Here.
David Joseph Burge, class of 1983.
Here.
Jimmy Wayne Hill, class of 1983.
Here.
Kelly Heasley Hellick, class of 1985.
Here.
Philip E. Sanders, Jr., class of 1985.
Here.
Casey Dominic Sullivan, class of 1985.
Here.
Robert Lynn Parker, class of 1986.
Here.
John Patrick Hay, class of 1988.
Here.
Stacy Lee Sackey, class of 1988.
Here.
Jason H. Barker, class of 1990.
Here.
Michael Richard Reed, class of 1990.
Here.
Teresa K. Leesky, class of 1993.
Here.
Edward Vidal Jasper, class of 1996.
Here.
Deborah Ibarra Mayfield, class of 1996.
Here.
Derek Delaney Dunlop, class of 2004.
Here.
Jessica Dawn Selby, class of 2011.
Here.
Jack Campbell.
Here.
Mark Edwards.
Here.
Anatoly Gashev.
Here.
Jimmy Josie.
Here.
Larry Kelly.
Here.
William Clem.
Here.
Dr. Carrie Kenneth Litzenberg.
Here.
James Machek.
Here.
Forrester Dubisi.
Here.
Mary Jo Powell.
Here.
The final segment of the worldwide roll call for the absent comprises corrections to some names that were called incorrectly or that were inadvertently omitted earlier in the reading of this roll.
Eugene Francis Polzer, class of 1954.
Here.
Zay W. Gilbreth, class of 1962.
Here.
John Herman Geeson, class of 1978.
Here.
Teddy B. Pope, class of 1987.
Here.
Christopher Bledsoe, class of 2002.
Here.
Charles A. Rodenberger.
Here.
William Goldapper, class of 1921.
Here.
John Joseph Luther, class of 1949.
Here.
William Henry Goldston, class of 1951.
Here.
John Henry Felton, class of 1953.
Here.
Robert Joseph Drozd, class of 1954.
Here.
Carlos Barton Griffin, Sr., class of 1954.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Gilbert James Altum, class of 1955.
Here.
William Richard Heaton, Sr., class of 1955.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Meade Rex Bramlett, Sr., class of 1956.
Here.
Colonel John Abe Webb, class of 1957.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Van Kolterman, class of 1958.
Here.
James Lewis Struthwolf, class of 1959.
Here.
Richard Garrison Gislin, Jr., class of 1960.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Dan Alford Groan, class of 1961.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Donald Allen Williamson, class of 1961.
Here.
Henry Christopher Ortega, class of 1962.
Here.
Charles James Schwertner, class of 1962.
Here.
Dr. Edmund Peter Segner, Jr., class of 1962.
Here.
John Bennett Siptak, class of 1963.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Russell Lee Keeling, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Charles Pinnell, class of 1964.
Here.
William Russell Ledbetter, Jr., class of 1965.
Here.
John T. Frazier, class of 1968.
Here.
Dr. Paula Dorothea Reese, class of 1968.
Here.
John William Lyles, class of 1969.
Here.
Michael S. Richard, class of 1969.
Here.
David Merrill Leicius, class of 1971.
Here.
James C. Powell, class of 1971.
Here.
Roger Lee Smith, class of 1971.
Here.
Tony Jim Corso, class of 1972.
Here.
Raymond Victor Demiliano, class of 1972.
Here.
Stephen Victor Lieb, class of 1972.
Here.
Stephen Patrick Kirkpatrick, class of 1973.
Here.
George Martin Herzog, Jr., class of 1974.
Here.
Julio Sines Jr., class of 1974.
Here.
Dr. Robert Ed Whitson, class of 1974.
Here.
Stephen Scott Baggett, class of 1975.
Here.
William Franca Rayleigh, class of 1977.
Here.
William Joseph Laughlin, class of 1978.
Here.
Dr. Aditi Kumar Angirasa, class of 1979.
Here.
Dennis James Seith, class of 1979.
Here.
Randall Kent Sneed, class of 1980.
Here.
Dale G. Bonura, class of 1981.
Here.
Gay Lynn Collins O'Connor, class of 1981.
Here.
Terry D. Thomas Angonia, class of 1982.
Here.
Stephen Kennan Davis, class of 1982.
Here.
Jeffrey Allen Wayland, class of 1983.
Here.
Michael Edgin Wilkes, class of 1983.
Here.
Dr. Mark Wayne Peckham, class of 1984.
Here.
Mary Elizabeth Barzak Higginbotham, class of 1985.
Here.
Dr. Ronald P. Delvecchio, class of 1986.
Here.
Dr. Mark Leon Bennett, class of 1989.
Here.
Amy Michelle McCormick, class of 1989.
Here.
Tanji Alicia Lewis, class of 1993.
Here.
Veronica Lee Vaughn McNew, class of 1996.
Here.
Dr. Stephen Kenny Shamatelli, class of 1997.
Here.
Manuel De Jesus Gonzalez III, class of 1997.
Here.
Felicia Oshibri Washington, class of 1997.
Here.
Leonard Adelbert Calloway II, class of 1998.
Here.
Stephen Colin Meyer, class of 2008.
Here.
Preston Wayne Ans, class of 2009.
Here.
Kevin R. Morgan, class of 2014.
Here.
Jared Michael Lewis, class of 2020.
Here.
Dr. William John Seeger, class of 2021.
Here.
Foster Nibidusi.
Here.
David Merrill Lachelt, class of 1971.
Here.
John E. Gummert, class of 1957.
Here.
John W. Balzer, class of 1952.
Here.
William Joseph Laughlin, class of 1978.
Here.
Dr. William Leonard Vandergrift, class of 1978.
Here.
Douglas W. Wild, class of 1978.
Here.
Dr. Aditi Kumar Angirasa, class of 1979.
Here.
Dennis James Scythe, class of 1979.
Here.
Stephen Wade Watley, class of 1988.
Here.
Dr. Mark Leon Bennett, class of 1989.
Here.
Amy Michelle McCormick, class of 1989.
Here.
Tanji Alicia Lewis, class of 1993.
Here.
Kristen Catherine Owero, class of 2024.
Here.
In Memoriam by Lieutenant Colonel David Harrigan, class of 1968. We stood a little taller and a little prouder then, when we heard the call of muster and the roll call just begin. We stood there all together and wiped away the tears when our names were called out softly and answered with a here. And so we've joined together with our brothers of the past to make our final resting place at Aggie Land, our last. We take a toast to our brotherhood wherever they may roam. For us, the trek is over. Aggie Land, we're coming home.
My fellow Aggies,
on behalf of the Association of Former Students, thank you for sharing this time with us today. We close this muster with a salute. We salute Texas A&M, the unique American institution that shaped each of us into the people that we are today and that continues shaping us every day. We salute the countless Texas Aggies who give so selflessly of their time and their effort by volunteering to plan and host hundreds of musters all around the world. And we salute each and every one of the Aggies we've lost in this past year, the friends and family whose names we called and for whom we proudly answered here, marking them forever present in our hearts on this Aggie Muster Day. The 2022 worldwide roll call for the absent is now complete, Aggies. Thanks and gig 'em. We'll meet some other day, but until we do, may all of our lives be filled with the spirit of Aggieland.
Some may boast of prowess bold, of the schools they think so grand, but there's a spirit can ne'er be told. It's the spirit of Aggieland. We are the Aggies are we, true to each other as Aggies can be. We've got to fight, boys, we've got to fight. We've got to fight for maroon and white. After they boosted all the rest, then they will come and join the best. For we are the Aggies are we. We are from Texas A&C.